The desert morning was still cool when Emma Carter stepped out of the narrow canvas doorway of the medic tent. The air was dry and faintly laced with the smell of diesel from the generators. Above her, the sky was a pale silver blue that would soon harden into the blazing white heat of midday. For now, there was a rare calm in the forward operating base, the kind of calm that soldiers pretended not to notice. Because here in the mountains of Afghanistan, calm was nothing more than the pause between storms. Emma adjusted the strap of her faded medic bag against her shoulder and moved with measured purpose toward the supply crates. She carried herself with quiet confidence, not the brash swagger of a combat veteran, but the steady presence of someone who knew exactly where she was needed. She was not tall, barely 5'5", but there was something in her posture that made people step aside for her without realizing it. Her hazel eyes had a way of locking onto people and holding them there, not in confrontation, but in understanding, as if she could see the pain before they spoke a word. Most in Bravo Company knew her as the one who patched up cuts, dressed burns, set broken bones, and handed out aspirin when the long patrols and cold nights wore the men down. Her file matched the description perfectly. Sergeant Emma Carter, field medic, standard Army training, 8 months in her deployment, reliable, competent, unshakable in the chaos of the field. No one suspected that her story was anything more than that. And that was exactly how Emma wanted it. 3 years earlier, her world had been entirely different. She had not been wearing desert fatigues and combat boots. She had been Dr. Emma Grace Carter, one of the youngest and most respected trauma surgeons in a major Baltimore hospital. Her white coat had carried weight, not just in the halls, but in the operating theater where she worked under pressure that crushed lesser hands. She had trained at one of the most competitive medical schools in the country, published research on surgical methods in resource-limited conditions, and taken on cases so complex other surgeons deferred to her without hesitation. That life ended the night a man died on her table. It had been a routine surgery, the kind she had done dozens of times before, but 36 hours without sleep had dulled her reflexes. A small lapse, a split second of hesitation, and the patient's vitals spiraled beyond saving. The hospital cleared her of negligence. The family did not press charges. Her colleagues told her it was an unavoidable complication. But Emma did not believe in unavoidable complications. In her mind, a surgeon was meant to carry the impossible, to outthink and outwork death itself. She could not forgive the moment her hands had failed. She left everything behind in the months that followed: the 6-figure salary, the apartment that overlooked the city skyline, the invitations to medical conferences. She traded them for the olive drab uniform of an Army medic. In her enlistment paperwork, she stripped her history down to the basics, only what was necessary to qualify. No mention of her years in surgery, no publications, no glowing performance reviews. She requested a posting far from cities and hospitals, somewhere remote, enough that she would never have to face the temptation of an operating table again. She thought she could balance the scales here, tending to soldiers on the battlefield, repaying in some small way the debt she carried to the one she could not save. For 8 months, she lived that way, the days full of routine injuries and the occasional battlefield casualty. She kept her head down and let the officers believe she was exactly what they saw, a capable medic with a knack for staying calm when blood was everywhere. She never showed more than she had to, never revealed the full range of skill she carried in her hands, and in a strange way the simplicity brought her peace. She was still in the business of saving lives, but the crushing weight of command decisions was gone. Here she was not the one who decided whether to open a chest in the middle of the night. She could focus on being useful without feeling like the entire outcome rested on her. Still, there were moments, small ones, when the old instincts surfaced, when she found herself reading injuries the way a surgeon does, seeing beneath the surface wound to the unseen damage inside. She would quickly push those thoughts down, telling herself it was just a medic's job to be observant. But in truth, it was the muscle memory of years in the operating room, knowledge that could never truly be unlearned. She prayed she would never be put in a situation where those instincts were the only things standing between life and death, because she feared what would happen if she crossed that line again. Emma did not know that the moment she dreaded was coming. and that when it arrived it would tear away the quiet life she had built in this dusty outpost. It would come with the sound of the ground splitting open, with the shockwave of an explosion so violent it would tear the air from her lungs, and it would force her to face the truth she had been running from since the night that Patient's heartbeat went flat under her hands. The desert was patient, but war was not, and soon it would demand more of her than she had ever planned to give. The sun had barely begun to rise above the jagged horizon when Emma stepped in a medical tent to restock her kit. The air inside was still cool from the night and smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with dust. She moved methodically, checking each compartment in her bag, replacing bandages, vials, and rolls of gauze, the kind of simple preparation that gave a quiet rhythm to mornings here. Outside she could hear the muted sounds of soldiers starting their day, boots on gravel, distant. Laughter, the metallic clang of gear being loaded onto trucks. At 0647 the world shattered. The first blast hit with a force that threw her to the floor. The canvas walls of the tent rippled, as if in a windstorm. Though the air was thick with heat rather than cold, she barely had time to register the sharp pain in her shoulder from the fall before a second explosion ripped through the base. This one close enough to blow out the tent's narrow windows. Shards of glass and dust filled the air, stinging her eyes. Then came the third blast, deeper, heavier, and something in the way the sound rolled over the compound told her this was no random mortar fire. This was coordinated, deliberate, designed to kill as many as possible in as little time as possible. Her body was already moving before her thoughts caught up. She grabbed her medic bag, slung it over her back, and ran toward the screams. The air outside was a haze of smoke and grit, the ground littered with debris. Through it she saw shapes moving, some upright and running, others crawling or lying still. Somewhere beyond the main gate, a black column of smoke twisted into the sky, and the acrid smell of burning fuel cut through the metallic tang of blood. The epicenter of the destruction was the barracks, or what had been the barracks. A massive vehicle-borne explosive had torn the building apart. Concrete slabs and twisted steel rebar lay in heaps. Soldiers were already digging through the rubble with their hands, shouting for help. The sound of groaning metal and muffled cries rose above the chaos. Emma pushed through, scanning faces, scanning injuries, her mind switching into the mechanical focus she had learned long before she wore an army uniform. Sergeant Michael Adams, his face streaked with blood from shrapnel cut on his scalp, was trying to coordinate the rescue. His voice was steady but urgent as he directed men toward the collapsed structure. When he saw Emma, he pointed toward a group of soldiers pulling a man from the debris. She dropped to her knees beside them, eyes sweeping over the injuries, calculating survival chances in seconds. A shattered femur with arterial bleeding, manageable with a tourniquet if done now. A soldier, pinned beneath a beam with suspected crush injuries but vital signs that suggested internal stability. One man with severe head trauma whose pupils told her the fight was already over. Each choice was a cut in the fabric of possibility. She worked fast, tagging some for immediate treatment, others for comfort care only, the triage that no medic ever wanted to perform but that battle demanded without mercy. It took only minutes for her to realize the truth. There were too many critical cases for one medic, and more still trapped in the rubble. Worse, some injuries required immediate surgical intervention. There would be no time to wait for evacuation. The nearest forward surgical unit could be an hour away, and in this chaos an hour might as well be a lifetime. Somewhere through the smoke and dust a voice called her name. She turned and saw Adams with two men kneeling beside a figure pinned beneath a twisted beam. She ran to them, her boots slipping on gravel and ash. What she found stopped her breath. Colonel Robert Hayes, the commanding officer of the base, lay there, his skin pale and clammy, a pool of bright red blood spreading beneath his leg, his breathing shallow, his eyes still open but clouded with pain. One glance told Emma the truth. Massive internal bleeding, likely from abdominal trauma, and an open fracture in the thigh with arterial tearing. Without surgery, in the next few minutes he would bleed out. Protocol whispered in her mind. A man with injuries this severe in a mass casualty event was to be marked as expectant, resources diverted to those with better odds. But looking into his fading eyes, Emma felt the same old pull, the same refusal to stand by when she had the skill to act. The field medic in her knew she should step back. The surgeon buried deep inside knew she could save him. If she was willing to cross the line she had been avoiding for years. She dropped to her knees, hands moving without hesitation, cutting away the fabric of his uniform to see the full damage. The rupture was worse than she feared, but still within the realm of possibility. If she could control the bleeding, repair the artery, and stabilize him, he might make it to a proper operating table. But the clock was already running down. She called for a surgical kit, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. Adams hesitated, staring at her, as if she had lost her mind. No one here had seen her perform anything beyond advanced field care, but something in her tone silenced him. Within moments the kit was in her hands. She took a deep breath, steadied herself, and prepared to operate in the open air under the shadow of burning rubble. A decision that would change not just the course of this day, but the way every soldier here saw her from this moment forward. Emma's knees pressed into the gravel as she opened the worn olive-drab surgical kit. Inside lay instruments designed for field emergencies, not for the kind of deep intervention she was about to attempt. The wind carried smoke and grit into her face, but her hands were steady. She blocked out the shouting, the clatter of metal being moved, the thud of boots running past. The rest of the battlefield narrowed until there was only her, Colonel Hayes, and the bleeding that had to stop before his heartbeat faded. She cleaned the area as best she could, working fast but precise, one hand clamping an artery while the other guided a curved needle through torn vessel walls. She had performed this exact repair dozens of times in sterile operating theaters under bright white lights. Here she had no such luxuries. Her tools were basic. Her lighting was the dim haze of morning through smoke. Her operating table was the dirt and rubble beneath her. Still, the motions came without conscious thought. The muscle memory of years in surgery guiding her through each movement. Around her the men watched with a mixture of confusion and awe. They had never seen a medic work like this, not with such efficiency, not with such depth of skill. Sergeant Adams muttered to himself, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew of her record. Emma ignored it all. Her focus was on each clamp, each stitch, each decision that meant the difference between the colonel's survival and the stillness that would follow if she faltered. Minutes felt like hours, but at last the bleeding slowed, the arterial flow secured. She shifted her attention to his abdomen. The swelling and rigidity told her the spleen was ruptured. In a hospital she would have opened him fully, but here she improvised, using pressure, packing, and every bit of battlefield stabilization. She could manage to hold back the internal bleeding long enough for evacuation. She started in 4, adjusted the fluid flow, monitored his breathing, her voice calm as she gave instructions to the soldiers around her. Turn him slightly, hold here, keep his head stable. Her tone carried a quiet authority that no one questioned. When she was certain he was as stable as she could make him in the dirt, she looked to Adams. They would have to move him to the evacuation point, 2 miles away through ground they had not yet secured. Adams shook his head, his eyes darting toward the hills where enemy fire might still come. But Emma was already making the call. She knew the longer they waited, the less chance Hayes had. Her mind weighed the risk and found there was no real choice at all. A backboard was found. They slid the colonel onto it carefully. But when she saw the uneven terrain ahead, Emma made another decision. She bent, hooked her arms, and hoisted the weight of the man across her shoulders in a fireman's carry. The strain was immediate, a crushing reminder of the burden she was taking on, but she locked her muscles and began walking, her steps deliberate. The world around her reduced to the rhythm of her boots striking gravel and the shifting weight of the man she refused to let die. They moved out, for soldiers forming a loose guard as they advanced. The path wound through broken earth and shattered walls, each step a calculated gamble that there would be no hidden mines, no sudden crack of rifle fire. The colonel's breath was faint against her neck, and every few minutes she stopped to check his pulse, adjusting his position, whispering short commands to those walking beside her. The weight on her back was more than flesh and bone. It was the weight of her choice, the weight of the line she had crossed when she decided she would rather defy protocol than watch another life slip away. Half a mile in, her thighs were burning, her lungs pulling in air heavy with dust. But she pressed on, the voice in her mind counting steps like she had once counted sutures in an endless night of surgery. Her training as a doctor and her endurance from those years of residency kept her moving forward, no matter the ache building in her shoulders. At one point Hayes stirred, his voice low and strained, telling her to put him down, to save her strength for others. Emma kept walking, answering with nothing more than a sharp breath, the kind that meant the discussion was over. She had no interest in explaining herself. Not now. Not while the desert waited for any sign of weakness to swallow them whole. The evacuation point was still distant, the ground still uncertain, but in Emma's mind there was no outcome except reaching it with Hayes alive. The decision she had made back in the rubble was one she would carry to the end, and if that end meant collapsing under his weight before they reached the helicopters, so be it. She would rather fall trying than stop and watch another heartbeat fade into silence. The first stretch of open ground was deceptively quiet, the kind of silence that presses against the ears and makes every footstep feel too loud. Emma kept her eyes scanning the terrain ahead, her body leaning slightly forward to counter the pull of the colonel's weight across her shoulders. Each step sank into the dry dust and left shallow prints that the wind immediately began to erase. The men around her moved in a staggered guard formation, rifles raised, eyes darting to every shadow, and, Rich, her breathing fell into a rough rhythm. 3 steps in, 1 slow exhale. The colonel's faint groan vibrated against her back now, and then, a reminder that every second counted. They passed the charred skeleton of what had once been a small outpost building, the smell of scorched wood mixing with the sharper metallic tang of old blood. Emma's mind compartmentalized it all, focusing only on forward movement, stability, and keeping Hayes alive long enough to see the evacuation team. Halfway to the first ridge, the sound of distant gunfire cracked the stillness. The squad tightened its formation. The pace quickened. Emma felt the colonel shift slightly as she adjusted her grip, the burn in her thighs spreading in her lower back. She ignored it, her mind drifting briefly to nights in the hospital when she had stood for hours over a single patient. Back then, her endurance had been built on caffeine and sheer stubbornness. Now it was built on the knowledge that stopping was not an option. At the first rise in the ground, she paused, kneeling carefully to check his pulse and blood pressure. Her fingers pressed against his neck, feeling the thin thread of life still moving beneath the skin. She adjusted the flow, tightened the makeshift bandage on his thigh, then stood again, rolling her shoulders once before pushing forward. Each time she lifted her legs, it felt as if sandbags were tied to her ankles. But the will to continue burned hotter than the fatigue. The terrain shifted into loose gravel, every step sliding slightly, forcing her to dig her boots in deeper. The squad moved with her, 2 in front, 2 behind, all aware that they were exposed on the slope. Emma's ears strained for the snap of a rifle or the whistling arc of incoming rounds. But the gunfire stayed distant, as if the enemy were waiting, watching, choosing their moment. By the time they reached the halfway mark, the sun was high, its heat pressing down with a weight all its own. Sweat soaked through her uniform, dripping into her eyes. The colonel stirred again, murmuring something that sounded like a plea for her to leave him. She answered with a slight shift of her shoulders, pulling him higher, letting the action speak for her. There was no leaving him, not while she still had strength to stand. The path dipped into a shallow gully. The air here was hotter, trapped between the low ridges, and Emma's breath came heavier, her legs trembling with each step. One of the soldiers moved closer, offering to take the load. She shook her head, unwilling to break the rhythm. She had carried him this far and would see it through. There was something in finishing the act herself, in making sure that the man she had chosen to save never left her care until she placed him directly into the hands of the evacuation team. They climbed the far side of the gully, boots slipping in the soft sand. The wind carried the faint thump of helicopter blades now, distant but growing. The sound was a lifeline, an anchor for her focus. She counted each beat of the rotors between her own breaths, using it to keep pace. The colonel's breathing steadied slightly, whether from her adjustments or from the approaching rescue. She could not tell. The final stretch was the hardest, A long flat plain of broken asphalt and scattered debris. No cover, no shade, the sun hitting them full force. Her body screamed for rest. Her arms ached from the constant tension of holding him secure. Every muscle in her back felt like it was pulled taut to the edge of tearing, but ahead she could see the rotor wash, kicking up dust in a wide circle. The olive-green shape of the helicopter dropping into the evacuation zone. The squad pushed harder, their pace matching the urgency in her stride. The noise of the helicopter drowned out the sounds of her own labored breathing. She reached the edge of the landing zone just as the medics inside jumped down. She lowered Hayes onto a stretcher, moving quickly to brief them on his condition. Her words clipped and precise, detailing every intervention she had made in the last 2 miles. One of the medics stared at her with something between disbelief and respect, his eyes flicking to the sutures, the bandaging, the signs of an operation done under conditions no training manual could cover. Emma only nodded once, stepping back as they lifted the colonel into the aircraft. The wind from the blades whipped grit in her face, but she kept her gaze fixed on him until the doors closed and the helicopter lifted away, carrying him toward the field hospital. The weight was gone from her shoulders, but in its place was a deep pull of exhaustion. She straightened, rolling her neck, and turned back toward the base. The 2 miles they had just crossed now stretched before her again. Only this time she would walk them empty-handed, her muscles heavy but her mind already shifting toward the wounded, still waiting among the rubble she had left behind. The walk back felt longer than the journey out. The adrenaline that had carried Emma across those 2 miles was fading now, leaving only the deep burn in her legs and the ache in her shoulders where the colonel's weight had pressed into her bones. The base was still a scene of controlled chaos when she arrived, but it had changed. A new team of medics and surgeons had arrived from a forward surgical unit, their gear spread across the ground, their hands already deep in the work of saving those she had been forced to leave behind. Sergeant Michael Adams stepped toward her, his face still streaked with dirt and dried blood, his expression a mixture of relief and disbelief. He told her the colonel was alive, that what she had done out there had given him a chance no one thought he had. Emma only nodded, her voice low as she said it had been a team effort, but Adams shook his head slowly, as if he knew she was understating the truth. She did not linger. There were still men to treat, burns to cool, wounds to clean, bones to set. The hours blurred into one another until the sun began to sink and the desert turned cold again. By the time she stripped off her gloves, her hands were trembling from exhaustion. Yet she felt no urge to rest, only the quiet pull of duty that had guided her since the moment the first blast shook the ground that morning. 2 weeks passed before Colonel Hayes returned to the base. His recovery had been faster than anyone expected, a testament to the work she had done in those first critical minutes. He asked to see her alone, his eyes studying her with the same sharpness she had seen in the operating room when a senior surgeon assessed a colleague's technique. He spoke of that day, of the surgery she had performed, of the choices she had made. His words carried both gratitude and curiosity, but when he asked who she really was before she became Sergeant Emma Carter, she met his gaze and simply said that the past did not matter, only the now. He did not press her. Instead, he told her he was recommending her for the Silver Star, that what she had done had gone beyond the call of duty. She told him she needed no recognition, only the chance to keep doing her job. He smiled faintly at that, a knowing kind of smile, and though nothing more was said, there was an understanding between them from that day on. She might be listed as a field medic, but they both knew she was something more. Word spread quietly among the soldiers. They came to her with injuries others could not handle. Officers began to seek her judgment on cases beyond the standard scope of a medic. She never confirmed anything about her background, but she stopped hiding her abilities. When surgery was needed and evacuation was impossible, she stepped in, her hands steady, her voice calm, her decisions sharp, the skills she had buried now finding their place in the chaos of war. 6 months after the attack, she received orders for reassignment. She would be teaching advanced battlefield medicine at the Army Medical School, training the next generation of combat medics to make impossible choices under impossible conditions. The recommendation had come from Hayes himself. In his report, he wrote that Sergeant Carter possessed medical knowledge and surgical skill far beyond her official qualifications. that she had proven herself capable of life-saving work under extreme conditions, and that whatever her past, she represented the pinnacle of what a combat medic could be. Emma accepted without hesitation. The war had given her a way to use every lesson she had learned, both in the sterile halls of civilian hospitals and in the dirt and dust of the battlefield. She could pass those lessons on now, shaping medics who would one day face the same decision she had, who would have to carry their comrades when carrying them meant the difference between life and death. She would never again call herself doctor, but she no longer needed the title. The work itself was enough. And so the woman who had once run from the weight of the operating room found herself standing between two worlds, a bridge between the precision of civilian surgery and the brutal necessity of combat medicine. Her past no longer a burden but a source of strength, and in the quiet moments she understood at last that saving lives was not a matter of what uniform she wore or what title she carried. It was simply who she was, and that truth was all she needed.